Something happens when people become reviewers. When people become reviewers, they try to be critical, which they should, but sometimes they go overboard and become suspicious of things that are being reported in the paper and become intolerant. So whenever you review a paper, there's a couple of things that I would hope you think of. So first of all, we all hate it when people ask us to do the impossible. I recently talked to somebody who told me that during COVID, one of the reviewers was adamant that they should go out and do a field study in a supermarket. I mean, that's not a very legitimate request at that time. So as a reviewer, maybe you should take the vantage point of authors a little bit more. And maybe you should ask yourself the question, what I ask of them, is that something that I could do or I think I would be able to do? Not everybody has the resources to run studies with an N of 200 or an N of 500 per cell. So maybe that's not a very legitimate request. Not everybody is comfortable to run, for instance, a field study during COVID. So maybe that's not a legitimate request. If authors run multiple studies in which they fail to show moderation, maybe it's not a legitimate request to ask these authors to run 10 more moderation studies until they find one that works. Because that actually is asking authors to engage in p-hacking. And you don't necessarily wish somebody would ask you that question. On top of that, it's important to be tolerant of imperfect findings and imperfect language. As far as language goes, not everybody is a native speaker. So some people will make grammatical and language mistakes. What you can do is ask that they should get their paper copy edited, but you can't really form a negative impression because they're not necessarily native speakers. Also, you cannot be too suspicious of imperfect findings. Even if people study something with a power of 80%, that does not necessarily imply that every study is going to be significant. So all too often, reviewers request that every study reports significant findings. But when you study something with an 80% power, that means that we can expect that 1 in 5 studies will fail to reach, say, a significant result. And that's 80% power. And that's mostly what people aim for nowadays. If somebody reports a p-value of 0.048, ever since the p-curve paper came out, that now seems suspicious to some people. It's not because somebody reports a p of 0.048 that necessarily implies p-hacking. I also personally object to the use of applying a p-curve analysis on a single paper. It's a little bit ludicrous, because what we would be doing then is looking at maybe 5 p-values and do a p-curve on 5 p-values. Nobody would do an analysis on 5 observations, and yet if you do p-curve analysis on a single paper, that's basically what you do. It's been shown that it's not very diagnostic, so why would you do it? However, if you think there's a problem with non-significant findings, if you think there's a problem with a p-value of 0.048, especially if several studies reported p-value around that threshold, what you can do as a reviewer is ask for more higher powered replications. You also need to consider that if an author fails to replicate the result that has been published in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean that that author is wrong. Maybe the result that has been documented in the past was not very stable. Especially if it's based on a single paper, we could ask ourselves the question, maybe there's something wrong with that published paper, not necessarily with the current, with the work of the current authors. Finally, a point that I want to make here is that a reviewer is not a co-author. It's not your paper if you're engaging, if you're a reviewer. And so authors really have the right to word things they want, unless that would be clearly wrong. So you have to ask yourself the question as a reviewer, does this point that I'm raising here, does addressing this point make the paper better? If it doesn't, maybe it's just a matter of taste, and you're entitled to your taste, but so are the authors. And so you shouldn't really impose the way you word things or the way you frame things onto the authors. You should leave them the autonomy to express themselves as they wish, as long as they are objectively correct. Tolerance doesn't mean that you have to accept everything. We do care about internal and external validity, but tolerance means that we maybe should be a little bit more understanding of papers that deviate from a blueprint of what we would consider a perfect paper.